Okay, so welcome to our first AI talk organized by Chalmers University and particularly by the Chalmers AI Research Center, which was recently established. So before starting today's talk with Professor Thomas Schön, I would just like to show you a few information about us, about this research center, and about this specific initiative. So just give me a second to share some initial slides. Okay, so what is the mission of CHAIR, which is the Chalmers AI Research Center? What we want to do is to strengthen AI basic research, so everything that concerns the development of methodology and the theory underlying AI, but also try to excel in the application, the practical application of AI in several strategic areas. We will see later some of our industrial partners. And in fact, build strategic collaborations with industrial partners is one of our main goals, besides building the methodological part and coordinate AI-related activities. And this is one of the AI activities that we want to push forward, and also integrate AI in our university curricula, so in our teaching, in our courses. So as you can see, if you go bottom down, well, what we want is to build solid AI foundations, so push forward machine learning studies, mathematical study, deep learning, algorithm and methods, to then produce what we call AI enablers. So the software that will allow us to push forward the application of AI in a number of applied sectors, without forgetting the importance of ethical issues for a better society, and therefore sustainability, equality, and innovation for a better society. So this is our structure, and I invite you to visit our website, chalmers.se/chair, and here we have some important partners that allow us to push forward our initiatives. I recommend you also, for you, those of you that are on Twitter, you can follow us and our updates and news. But of course, you can also subscribe to our newsletter, and that you can find at these websites, and specifically the newsletter that is pertinent for this type of talks that you are attending today, AI talks. And today we have the very first talk of this initiative. So what we would like this talk to be, this type of talks to be, well, we would like to have talks from leaders in the AI field, but we would like also to be inspired on how AI can affect research, business, and society. And also, we want this talk to be actually of interest to a wide audience without being overly technical. And this is a challenge. Can we try to make this challenge a success? So we try this today. And we start with our first speaker, which is Professor Schön from Uppsala University. He is now Bezier Professor of Artificial Intelligence at that university. And his main interests are in machine learning, but he's also publishes into statistics, automatic control, and computer vision. He has received many accolades, both in Sweden and internationally. So he's an elected member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering and Science and the Royal Society of Sciences in Uppsala. And he's the recipient of the Erlanger and Armour Prize in 2016. So this is basically everything from me right now. And in a moment, I welcome Professor Schön on the podium. His talk is entitled AI for Research, Some New Result on Deep Regression. Before we start, the idea for today is that you're all muted, and you cannot unmute yourself right now, but you can post your questions, and I encourage you to write in the Zoom chat your questions, which I will select later. And if it works well, let's see how this first experiment works. If it works well, I will unmute you and you will pose the questions directly. If it doesn't work so well, I will read your question to the presenter. So before moving forward with other news, actually, let's give the podium to Professor Thomas Schön. And Thomas, feel free to unmute yourself. Thank you so much for being here. And well, now the audience of 84 people is here with you to be inspired. So please inspire us.
I'll do my best. So thanks a lot for this kind invitation. It's great to be here. Well, as you understand what I mean by that. So let me share my screen. All right. So I'm going to talk a bit about AI and its use for research. So this will be both basic research within AI and applied where we use this in other scientific areas, so to speak. And that's my strategy, to work with both basic research and to apply this in various other areas. So in machine learning, I usually talk about 4 cornerstones. So first of all, as you know, it's data. Typically, we need lots of it, even though it's extremely interesting to try to figure out what to do in small data situations. The current state of the art requires a lot of data. Then we need some form of mathematical model, which is a compact representation of the data that in a precise mathematical form captures the key properties that we're out after. The third one is a learning algorithm or inference algorithm or estimation algorithm or whatever you want to call it, which is used to compute some unknown variables from the observed variables that we have. And here, of course, we make use of the model that we're working with. And the fourth one is decisional control. So in the reinforcement learning part, where you use the current understanding of the situation to steer it into a desired state. And this is where my background is from control from before. All right, so that's my way of trying to capture the key things that we're working with. And the key lesson I've taken away from contemporary machine learning is that flexible models are the ones that often gives us the best predictive performance these days. So if that is true, then the next question is probably what is a flexible model and how can I work with it? And that will be the core of my talk. I'm more or less only going to be working with these flexible models. So how can we build these? Well, there are many ways. One is to use deep learning, which is the obvious go-to technology of today, I would say. But there are many other ones. And I think a very interesting question at this time is to think about what alternatives are there? What else can you do? Because that's what's going to be important 5 years from now. So if you have not already been thinking about that, that could be something to think about. I'll give you a few thoughts on how I work in that sense. And the other way of doing this is in a non-parametric fashion, for example, using Gaussian processes that I'll show a few examples of very quickly later on. All right, the aim I have with this talk is to motivate using 3 concrete examples, the use of AI in science, and to show a new approach for deep regression. So I'm trying to, at the same time, keep the discussion accessible to a general audience, as Umberto said. But I could not resist sneaking in a few new results on deep learning for regression problems towards the end, for those who are interested in that. So I'll give you these 3 examples that I've been working on over the past 3 years or so, 2-3 years. So this is a medical example, which is human level ECG diagnosis. Then an example from physics using building models for magnetic fields. And a third one from biology, where we work with probabilistic programming for inference in phylogenetics, which are the tree of life, if you like. And then a few words about deep probabilistic regression. And I also want to say something about machine learning education towards the end, since I think this is important for the Swedish universities. So again, the key lesson, as I mentioned before, or one key lesson, at least for me, is that these flexible models, for some reason or another, gives us the best predictive performance. All right, for those of you who are not so much into the area, I'll be talking a lot about supervised machine learning, which means that you have access to lots and lots of data, here illustrated using images, and then someone has kindly labeled those images, telling us, informing us, and in particular the computer, about what we see in the image. We then have our so this was the first cornerstone. The second cornerstone is the model, quite often a deep neural network when it comes to images, and then a learning algorithm, which is used to update the model such that our predictions are useful when we get to see unseen data. That is data which does not come with a label. That's what you have in the production system in the end, because then the model will provide you with a prediction. And this model that you have learned must then generalize to new unseen data. And I'll continue by saying a few words about deep learning before moving into the example where we use this for a medical application in cardiology. So the mathematical model itself has been around for a very long time, and many of you have used it in various ways. But over the past decade, I think it's fair to say that there's been a bit of a revolution here, in particular in some fields like computer vision, which has changed to a large extent. I guess something that Thomas Kuhn would have called a paradigm shift, and speech and so on. And the key reasons, according to me at least, for this is that we have very large data sets, solid computers, enormous industrial interest, which gives rise to lots of money for thinking about these things. And there's been some methodological breakthroughs as well. But the key here, I think, is the data sets, the computers, and human behavior, if you like. So the underlying idea here is to represent a function. It's just a massive nonlinear function. And the thing is that if we use a deep hierarchical model here, that can be exponentially more efficient than a shallow model. That's the main takeaway. Properly understanding this, that we don't do. We don't know how to do that yet. We know that it delivers and that it works. We don't understand exactly how to. And this functional representation has multiple levels of abstraction, often containing millions of parameters. And these parameters are then automatically determined based on a large amount of training data. So a very simple yet fairly accurate description of a neural network is by starting from linear regression that you know from before. So an output is a linear function of the input variables and some noise on top of that. So you have the parameters, they are the red things here, and the inputs are the x's in blue, and an output, also blue here, y. All right, and then you wrap a nonlinear function around that linear regression, and then you keep doing this sequentially. So you can think of a neural network as a sequential construction of these so-called generalized linear regressions. So let's try and use this model for a problem. So the problem is the following. We have access to millions of ECG recordings. So these are the standard ECG recordings that are taken at hospitals around the world as we speak, as it's the first thing you do when you investigate a heart. Then there are 12 electrodes placed on the chest, and they record the electrical activity of the heart for around 7 to 10 seconds. And based on that, a skilled cardiologist can very quickly see what goes on. That's a super simple description of what's happening, but it's more or less what goes on. The current situation is that we need a human being for this. There are, and there has been for a long time, automated diagnosis, but it's, at least to my friends in cardiology, it's not good enough quite yet. And the situation, our background is slightly different. So we are in a good situation here in Sweden, where all of us have access to a skilled cardiologist if we really need one very fast. They are done at the hospital. But this is worked together with friends from Brazil, where this is not quite the situation. So they live in a state called Minas Gerais, which has the size of Spain, or even larger, I think, and 20 million people, fairly uniformly distributed. And there are very few big cities. So someone living there can have a very far distance to the closest cardiologist. Still, of course, they experience the same problems with their hearts as we do. So this has been recognized, and they have been collecting data for more than 10 years in a telehealth network, which gives them roughly 2.3 million ECGs, and more are coming in every day, of course. So these are taken in a real clinical setting, which gives this some clinical relevance as well. So that's the data that we have been using. And what we've done is to we build a neural network or we train a neural network for this, a fairly standard structure. And thanks to all, I would say all of that data, we are reaching human level medical doctor performance on certain specific tasks. So we have looked at 6 common ECG abnormalities, like atrial fibrillation, which is a common problem, sinus tachycardia, and so on. And for these, we are doing quite well, or the method is actually. And the key difference here to what I will call classical engineering, so the way I was trained, signal processing control, would be more try to figure out, using pen and paper, good mathematical models for this. But here, we don't do that. Instead, we use a completely generic model via this particular neural network, which is then trained end-to-end using all these ECGs. So this I view as an interesting example of something that could be quite useful in the situation in Brazil, maybe not so much in our clinical setting here in Sweden at the moment, but perhaps later on. So the idea there in Brazil is to be able to pinpoint people who really need to get medical attention fast, since that involves traveling possibly a quite far distance. All right, so then I'm going to switch to a different, that was the medical example. I'll give you an example in physics. I should also say I'll make the slides available on my website in case anyone wants to have a look. I'll give a few pointers to papers. So this is, again, in physics. So we have the Earth magnetic fields, which always sits in the background. And as you pick up, oh, well, here's one, a magnetic object, that will cause a distortion to the Earth magnetic field, which could be good or bad, depending on what you want to do. For example, if you want to use the magnetic field for positioning, which I think is extremely attractive because most of us carry around the sensor for free. The magnetometer sits in most of the smartphones. So if you then had a map of the magnetic field and how it changes, you could use that to figure out where you are. If you have a map of this distorted field, the problem is that there's no one delivering them yet. So we need to build them ourselves. So that's what we did using a different flexible model. So we used the Gaussian process here. And here is something that's mathematically, I think, pretty cool in terms of its usefulness, not so cool perhaps. But what we did is to, when I say we, I mean in particular Niklas and Arno and Manon here, and later Carl as well, is to customize this such that it obeys Maxwell's equations, because Maxwell figured out how the magnetic field behaves in a very nice way. And this, of course, we can use. Unfortunately for this example, that did not improve the situation so much from using a purely data-driven model, actually. But the other examples where that is. So basically built a model. Here I show this is a vector field. The magnetic field is a vector field in 3 dimensions. Here I just illustrate the strength of the field when we built this model at Uppsala University. And since then, we have used this for indoor positioning. That's also been commercialized. And that gives you an accuracy of a couple of meters, depending, of course, on the magnetic environment that you're in. We're also doing a SLAM solution, so simultaneous localization and mapping. So where we solve the problem online as you go, computing both the map and the position. So that we're working very intensely on right now. It should be finished within a month or two, I think. But so this is one particular example of something that I like, a very obvious idea, but where there's still surprisingly little done, which is blending prior knowledge and data-driven models, like we talk about. Again, in this example, the inclusion of Maxwell's equation did not help. It did not offer better performance, neither was it worse. But in general, I think this is a good idea, and we have examples where this actually helps a lot as well. So the obvious idea, as I said, is to combine the two. And I see over the past year or two, I've seen more and more people talking about this and actually starting doing this. So it means that we start from small rigid models describing the phenomenon that we study. We have plenty of those models from many different fields. And then we augment them in various ways with flexible models driven by data. So I do believe that there are massive gains to be made in this simple combination. Again, for those who have been around for a longer time, this pops up associations to things from before, of course. The new thing here being sneaking in the new data-driven models that we have of today. So the vision here would be to build flexible model building blocks that contains the basic knowledge that we have about the phenomenon that we are studying. And then the model should be flexible enough for new knowledge to be gained. So we get a bit of the best of both worlds here somehow. So this, I believe, has the potential to allow us to also learn new basic knowledge, so filling gaps where there are. So again, a reflection on this is quite obvious, really, but surprisingly little has been done. And I foresee quite a lot to happen here. So the resulting technical challenge, if you take a Bayesian point of view, I mean, if you don't like a Bayesian point of view, doesn't matter, take whichever you want. But then what we need to do is somehow use these known structures and domain knowledge in designing priors, or another way of encoding background knowledge. And then once we have designed such a prior, that will restrict the flexibility of the resulting object in a goal-oriented fashion. So the question is, what's then the right blend of these things? So I'll give you very briefly, we could give a long technical talk of this at some time, I guess, but here I'll just give you one slide. So linear functional constraints and measurements, they are extremely useful in describing nature, and they're super simple to work with. That's why we use them so much. So what we have done here, I'll give you a few examples, like the magnetic field, for example, which is curl-free. So that's the property that we encoded there. And there are quite a few measurements that can be expressed as line integrals of a target function. For example, in CT, that's what you do. And in strain field reconstruction that we work with with data from these neutron diffraction experiments that we've done or our colleagues have done in Japan at JPark. So what we've then, so these are the applied part of it. What we've then done is to develop a Gaussian process that's linearly constrained. So it's uncertain in all ways, save for these linear constraints that could come from these realities or from somewhere else. Since then, we also developed neural networks that are linearly constrained. So neural network that will obey these constraints, but otherwise free. So these are concrete examples of what I fluffily talk about here, just to give it some rigor at least. If you want to have a look, the papers are available, so you can dig into them. I'm switching fields to biology. And here I'll give you a bit of a background on phylogenetics. So statistical phylogenetics is something that's used heavily in some areas of biology and life sciences in general, I would say. So here we're interested in learning parameters or models that involve evolutionary trees. So here is one tree that we have been working on with whales and dolphins. So there's some common ancestor. At some point in time, that one splits into two new species, and the speciation goes on as time goes on downwards like this. And then at the end, you have the species available. So this is a very small phylogenetic tree. We want to be able to do this for massively larger trees. And then we can learn things about how species develop, and unfortunately how they nowadays also tend to go extinct. And this is important for a wide range of life science applications. And indeed, a research front in many disciplines is actually, to some extent, defined by our ability to learn these parameters in realistic phylogenetic models. And recent models allow us to have diversification rates that varies across the different lineages here. Which is cool, because then you can account for the fact that things always change over time. The hard part, or the for us interesting part, is that the resulting estimation problem becomes way harder. And what we have done here is we work with probabilistic programming, which is one of my bets on something that could be super interesting later on. We'll see, just because I believe that's probably not going to happen, but you have to do something, right? And it's fun to work with, and it's an interesting mix of people building programming languages and people from statistics and machine learning backgrounds coming together. So in that sense, it's a very interesting area to discuss ideas, I would say. It was challenging at times, of course, but mainly interesting. So this has the potential to, in some sense, be disruptive for the sciences in providing rapid automated prototyping of algorithms and models for data. So the reason we're using it together with phylogenetics is because this is typically studied by people in biology who, some of them are extremely skilled, I must say, in MCNC and other techniques and the piece of math that you need. But most of them have other interests. And they want to be able to test their hypotheses. So what we do with probabilistic programming is that we give them a way of testing this without having to do all the inference machinery. And probabilistic programming gives you a programming language, Turing complete in many cases, programming language, with support for declaring random variables, support for conditioning on observed data, and importantly, also automatic inference. And it gives you a clear separation between the model and the inference methods, which encourages the model-based thinking that is quite useful in many areas. And to study this, we developed our own programming language, probabilistic programming language that we call Birch, which we describe in this paper, and you can download and play around with it if you want. And here, another trend that I see and want to continue working with is the automation of algorithms. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, one of the first algorithms I worked with during my PhD was something called a Raoult localized particle filter, which is a combination of something called a particle filter and a Kalman filter. Of course, you can sit down with pen and paper, as I did, and derive the algorithm, which we'll then have to do for each individual model. So time-wise, very costly. So what we've done now in Birch is that we give Birch the capability of automating this. So as soon as it sees, as soon as it compiles a model where this is possible, it will automatically derive the appropriate Raoult localized particle filter. By working with the mechanisms that are useful. So we have never told it about what a Raoult localized particle filter is. We've just provided the mechanism to putting together that algorithm. And that is something I think could be extremely interesting. in the future if we manage to automate more algorithms in this way. And I view probabilistic programming as one way of enabling this kind of automation. It's the best I've seen so far, at least, that we talk about in this AI stats paper. All right, with that, I'll say a few words about what we're doing here in Uppsala, where we are also starting up a new AI lab. And inspired by these three examples and many other things, but these are the ones where I've been, to some extent at least, involved. I want us to develop and make use of AI for research. So we're building a new lab in this building, so our old library. It'll be a nice way of fusing the new with the old, I would say. The reason for staying in the library is that it's neutral grounds for everyone here. So here we will all meet. So there will be people from medicine, there will be people from technology and natural sciences and the humanities as well, which I think for the topic of AI is very natural. And the key mechanism we're using for this is internal sabbatical periods. So just before lunch today, I had the first meeting with the first ones that will move in together with me after the summer. So they will spend half time for 1 year and bring along 1 or 2 other PhD students and postdocs to fuel up the ideas that we start working on. All right, so with that, so these were small snippets or glimpses into a few, I would say, use cases. In the last example, there were actually some real developments in machine learning as well. So now I'm going to switch and talk a bit about deep probabilistic regression. So this is a bit more narrow, if you like, or focused, depending on which word you prefer. So again, supervised regression, as you know, we're given a bunch of data, X and Y's, input, output, and they stem from some probability distribution that we don't know. And based on this, we want to be able to make predictions when we get an unseen input. Very much like the first example I gave you from medicine, which is exactly on this form. We're going to use a deep neural network, which I spoke briefly about before. So it's just a massive function, typically a big function f, parameterized by some red things here, the thetas, that maps the blue input to the blue output. Okay. So interestingly, deep learning for classification, we know pretty much how to handle that. We have standard losses and output representations. So for sure, more questions to be answered, but this is a fairly standard way of dealing with this. To my surprise, when we started looking at this, at least to me, this is not the case when it comes to regression. So this caught our interest. So what we set out to do here is to train a model, a predictor model of the conditional target density using a deep neural network that predicts this unnormalized density directly from the input and the output pair. I'm going to make this sounds a bit fluffy, so I'll make it way more concrete in a second. And then we use this for various applications in computer vision. So because there are many computer vision problems, as I've learned recently over the past year, that can be formulated as regression problems, and probably should be. For example, target tracking in video sequences, where we achieve very good results with this piece of technology at the moment. So let me take you through 4 existing, let's see how we do on time. Yes, I still have some time. So 4 existing approaches to deep regression. The first one, the most obvious one, is to simply train a deep neural network to predict the output. So this is your neural network. This is then trained by minimizing some loss function, as usual, which penalizes the difference between the ground truth and the predicted output. Very common choices are the L2 or the L1 losses. Interestingly, what is implicitly done here is that you assume a very specific model for the conditional target density, which quite often does not make sense. So for example, if you use the L2 loss, that corresponds to a conditional predictor that is normally distributed with a mean value and a constant variance. Which of course is one model, but it's very restrictive. So people understood this and came up with something else, which is, the idea is basically spurred by this insight that this is a very simple model. We typically want to work with more flexible models. So what people did is to say, in something we call probabilistic regression, why not let your network predict the mean and the variance, for example, or some other parameters of the probability density itself. So that's arguably more general than what we have from before. So if I take the example we had with a one-dimensional Gaussian, then you just let the network output the mean and the variance, if you like. So then at least we are a bit more, slightly more general than before. But there is no reason to stop here. We still have the sort of problem here that it's assumed to be normal. So that's given rise to more specialized methods in fairly recent years. So one of them is what we call confidence-based regression, where you train a model to predict some kind of scalar confidence value and then maximize this to predict the output. And then we'll have, I guess, a fourth one, perhaps not so interesting, but sometimes work, just say, well, regression is hard, so I'm just going to discretize the output into a finite set of classes and then use standard classification techniques. I'm going to go a bit faster on this, I think. I just want to point out the energy-based models that we're using here. So an energy-based model specifies a probability density in the following way. So they have been used a lot in physics and machine learning for a long time, I would say. I only learned about them very recently, but I think I'll continue using them. So you specify the density as the expected, as the e to the power of f, and then f is some parameterized scalar function. Typically, these days we would use a deep neural network for this one. Then you have something, a way of encoding a very expressive distribution. And it has, as I said, a long history in machine learning. Here are a few good papers, early papers. There are newer ones. It's being used quite a lot for semi-supervised learning at the moment, and also for image generation tasks. So the way we use this, let me skip that and look at this one instead, is to get something which has a clear probabilistic interpretation, in the sense that we learn the predictor model without requiring it to belong to a particular family of distributions. So we simply employ the energy-based model parameterized by a deep neural network in the following way. So that's all good and fine. The challenge is, of course, how do we train this? So a good thing about this is that it is indeed flexible. So here is a little toy example just to show the situation. So input, output, this is a ground truth. If you use a Gaussian, you get something like this, which is to be expected, because of course a Gaussian cannot take care of the fact that there are two different modes here, whereas this energy-based model has no problem with that. So the good thing is the modeling capacity. The less good thing, or the bad thing, I guess, is that training is challenging. But you can do something. So what we have done is to use something called noise contrastive estimation, which was published at AI Stats 10 years ago, which is extremely useful, I must say. I only very recently learned about this. So then we can use that to train these energy-based models for regression tasks. And what we have done here is a generalization of noise contrastive estimation, where we account for noise in the annotation process. Because if someone is set to annotate a plane or a bird, we will typically get slightly different results. And that is explicitly taken care of in this training method. If you're interested in the results, I'll just point you to papers where it's described in more detail. So we tried it out on a few regression tasks from computer vision, like object detection, which can be formulated as regression, can also be formulated in other ways, of course, age estimation, head pose, and visual tracking. So here I'll show an example of visual tracking. So the task is the following. You need to estimate the bounding box of the object you want to track. So someone in the first frame draws this bounding box, and then the algorithm need to figure out where that box is in the continuous sequence of frames. So maybe I should show a video of that just to give you a feeling. So here you see that the first frame, and someone draws this box, and that's our previous algorithm. We have a slightly better one now, and this is another state-of-the-art algorithm for tracking. And then as we are moving around, you see the results. This is, of course, just one sample. We have run this on there are quite a few tracking data sets available, so the results from those are available in that paper. I might show you a second one. If you don't like biking, we can of course go running. So that's another example, which is challenging in the way that there are fewer and fewer pixels of the object that we're tracking later in the movie. It still managed to get it. So here, when you see this, you see that there are quite a few things. There are occlusions, there are all sorts of challenging things that goes on. My simple take on this is that by using our flexible model here, there is room to encode that without us having to manually encode it, which I think is important for challenging things like this. Okay. With that, let's see how we do on time. So I have time to say just a few words about machine learning education, where we have spent a lot of time here over the past 5-6 years, I would say, developed 2 new courses, which are available for anyone who is interested in reusing, copying, stealing, whatever you want. Everything is open, so you can reuse it. They've been designed for our Swedish civilingenjörsstudenter in year 4 and 5. So the first one is on supervised machine learning, starting from the basics, focusing on not so much on the specific techniques, but more on the understanding. That's at least our aim here, with mini projects, computer labs, and written exams. And we've given this since 2017, and it's very popular among the students. And this organically gave rise to a book project, because despite the many books there are, we still saw the need for a new one. And that will be published by Cambridge University Press next year, and it's freely available. It will continue to be freely available forevermore via this link, so you can have a look if you want. Let's see if I can show you that. Here you go. So here is the textbook, table of contents, and you can download the latest draft of the book by clicking here. And if you have any comments, we have a GitHub account to just provide us with feedback if you want. The second one is newer. We gave it for the first time last autumn, which is like a follow-up where we go more into the Bayesian perspective, talk about graphical models, approximate inference, Gaussian processes, and for those of you who recognize this, if you don't, that's the gradient of the elbow, which is used in driving the V8s that we also go through here. Here we use an oral exam, which I find interesting and worked extremely well, actually. So again, feel free to use that if you want. I'm starting to use up my time here. It's 1:45, so let's conclude. So again, while these machine learning techniques are rightfully used more and more in industry, we also see scientists, for very good reasons, becoming aware of the potential in using machine learning in fundamental research. This is a key reason why we set up this new lab in the main library here. And I tried motivating that via these 3 concrete examples. Of course, I used probably too little time for each of them, but the idea was to give you a general feel for what can be done. And I introduced what I believe is a useful model and learning algorithm for deep regression problems. And I want to say, especially for those of you who are young, but to everyone, that remember to talk to people who work on different problems with different tools in other fields. That, I think, is extremely important, and something that we are trying to do with this new century as well. And finally, I want to say trevlig midsommar. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I clap my hands as a representative of the audience. That was an excellently timed talk and very clear. Thank you so much. So we received a few interesting questions, and please, I would like to ask the rest of the audience, feel free to add more. But there are a few that I can just read easily, and not necessarily in the order that when they have been posed, because I think there is one which immediately connects to your last sentence. So you were encouraging researchers, students, practitioners to visit each other's lab and learn from each other. So there is this a question posed by Yuhe that is connected, and it's first complimenting you, like about your impressive work in medicine, physics, and biology. So the question is, what are what do you think are the challenges for you to acquire the domain knowledge that you need in order to collaborate with other researchers in different areas? How do you resolve this question, which is a difficult question, I would say?
It's also a very good question, I would say. So it's, and this is not so much about technical understanding, it's more about understanding human nature. And I think with everything we do in life, it's much better to go about trying to understand people than trying to be understood. Many people walk around trying to be understood. These are not my words. These are some clever person. But it's something I read a long time ago, which ever since has affected the way I try to engage. So always try to understand, because when you understand, then it's much easier to interact and see where you fit in. So there's no way I understand everything that I need to do the work that we're doing in phylogenetics, for example. That's why we, of course, and there's no need for me to do that either, because I've great friends in biology who knows more than we need in this area. But I have the background, and our team has the background in machine learning and probabilistic programming that is required for this. So then it comes to the really challenging part, I think, is to be able to see this, both need to see this, and in some cases more than two, I mean, there's several people, to see and respect each other, genuinely try to understand each other in moving forward. And then these, I think, truly amazing and interesting things happen. That it takes time. That's also one of my key principles that I usually tell my students. I call it TTT. I think it's Leonard Jung who told me that at some point. It means things take time, TTT. There's no way around that, at least not for me. So allow it to take time, try to genuinely understand and spend time together. That works very well for me, I must say. It's not much harder than that.
And I will say that probably people like us, let's say mathematicians, machine learners, computer scientists, we're sometimes approached in order for us to provide help, but sometimes we're not ourselves humble enough to actually study the application area to try to help And we are not machine. We cannot give an answer straight away. We need to be humble and study each other's fields.
Yeah, and here it's also, I want to say something more when you say that. So here it's also important not to become a help desk, if you like. That's also something that I always look out for and sometimes change directions and so on. Because we want, as I said in the beginning, at least we're striving to do basic research in machine learning, statistics, whatever it might be. And also to do the applied research. But I don't want to do only applied research. This is I'm not saying that's perfectly fine, but for me, that's not fine because I really enjoy the basic research questions. And the cool thing is these things coexist, they live together. So the applications feed in to the basic research. Like I tried to show via concrete examples with this new Gaussian process and these new neural networks that we have derived. There's no way we could have done that without first being exposed to these problems in physics, both from neutron refractions and from modeling of magnetic fields. So that's the kind of loop that you want to go in here. But for like you said, I mean, it's important for, I think at least, for people doing machine learning and AI type research, not to become help desks, because that is not productive. I've not seen anyone enjoying that for a long time. I mean, you can definitely do it for a couple of months. That's effectively what we are doing, which is fine. But then one should step back and see how can we draw general knowledge from this.
And talking about how to draw general knowledge, let's go to a slightly more technical question. And I think that you addressed this question, but this was introduced before you actually talked about how can we develop a prediction model that is completely based on data? But let's assume that we have absolutely no understanding of the phenomenon itself. Is that something that we can actually achieve, and is it any good actually to try to achieve something like that?
No, I think that's, if I understand the question correctly, that's sort of what we're doing with, for example, the energy-based model I showed you. I briefly mentioned it. That's all I did, I guess. But that's an extremely general model. Of course, I still need to design a network to be used within that model. But again, arguably that's a very, very general one. And the same for the Gaussian process, which is also a non-parametric general model in that sense. So it's purely driven by data, I would say. So if you take away the data, then nothing is left.
But somehow you still choose a model. If you decide to choose a Gaussian process, you have to, you decide.
I still make key decisions. So for example, in the Gaussian process, I still need to decide on which kernel to use and which hyperparameters to use. And this is essential for its performance. So definitely I'm using some kind of insight in doing that. And the same goes for a neural network. I mean, selecting a good and neural network, that's a fine art, which I have the highest respect for. I mean, you need lots of engineering understanding to actually do this.
Alexander poses a question about, is it possible to find a model which is trained faster than deep neural networks? I'm posing the question just as I read it.
Train faster than, well, depends on what. Yes. Okay. Of course, we can define a simple model that we can train super fast, but it depends on what you want to use it for, of course.
Absolutely.
So for a key problem with the deep neural networks that we have, as anyone who has worked a little bit with them, is that they are super expensive to train in terms of, independent of how you measure it. It takes time, it takes lots of energy, and so on, which is problematic. And that's why, one reason why many people are working on improving stochastic optimization, for example, to actually make this faster and use less energy. This becomes extremely important in natural language processing, where the models are ridiculously big.
Okay, and Devdat ask, will energy used models specialize naturally to exponential families, for example?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, for sure. Since it's defined via the exponential, you can then restrict the function f, which we allow to be parameterized by neural network. If you restrict that to, for example, a quadratic, you'll get out the normal distribution, and so on and so forth. So absolutely. So it specializes to exponential families in that way. But I think the most interesting thing is that the way it generalizes the exponential family, if you like, to allow us for not being trapped in the Gaussian convenience.
Absolutely. And Jakob asked a question related, specifically related to his field, which is model-informed drug development. So in his field, a natural part of model predictions is the degree of uncertainty of the model predictions. And this is important decision-making. So the question is, how do you see the emerging field of quantifying prediction uncertainty in machine learning models?
Yeah, this is an extremely good question, an important question, which is people are spending lots of time working on this as we speak. And that you can see if you look into NeurIPS or ICML, for example. There will be entire sessions on Bayesian deep learning and so on, looking into problems to do with deep learning, uncertainty quantification in deep learning. And there's much to be done. We've come some way, but there's still much to be done. And I do believe not only for the applied side, so to speak, that uncertainty is important. I think uncertainty and being able to work with it is absolutely key. I did not stress that too much in my talk today, but I would say, if I allow myself to reformulate the question slightly, what is the most important piece of math to build good AI? Then my take would be probability, to be able to work with uncertainty and work with systematically encode that into the models and into the decision making. So I think it's absolutely key, and we know how to do this to a small extent, but there's way more to be done, which is interesting and good for us doing research in the area.
There is basically no way to actually trust the ability of our model to generalize if we don't assess the uncertainty in the predictions.
That's super important. That's why we set apart test sets, right, and try to, so we can at least to some extent validate it. But again, it's yeah, more. We need more there.
I was curious about a provocative question, a provocative sentence in your slides about probabilistic programming, which is potentially disruptive for the sciences. Do you actually mean, do you connect it somehow with finally at some point we were managing to use, for example, symbolic calculus, or when symbolic calculus was implemented in Wolfram Alpha? Do you think that basically we sort of get lazy and just let the machine do the work? Was that what you implied?
Yeah, so indeed it was a bit provocative just to wake people up. But I also, it's not just for that reason. I also do believe that there is actually potential to automate some parts. I mean, not the entire workflow for someone. If we stick to the example in biology where you test hypotheses about evolution, for example, then you're typically not so interested in setting up the MCMC machinery that you need. So if we could take away just 10-20% of their workload there, they can spend that time on more, for them, more interesting things. So that's what I mean by disrupting, in this sense, that we provide that capability. This is more the strive and vision, but I see that this piece of technology could have that potential, actually.
Absolutely. The co-host for this session, Frederick, poses a question. Frederick, feel free to open the microphone so that it's going to be more interesting to hear someone else as well.
Thank you. I wasn't quite prepared for that.
Sorry.
For a great talk, Thomas. It was very nice listening to you. So I was curious if you think that your regression paradigm will lead to new properties of models that we don't get automatically from least square regressions. For example, robustness, or whether you can encode other things that you want in these, well, I'm going to call them priors, that we don't get normally.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good question. It definitely gives new properties because depends on what you compare with, but let's say we compare with a standard approach, which is to use the neural network to directly predict the output, for example, using an L2 loss function. So that corresponds to a normal distribution. Corresponds to assuming a normal distribution for the predictive distribution. And of course, the normal distribution has massive problems with uncertain events. So that's my take on when you say robustness. So for example, if we have a data set where we have outliers present, so things that are strange in one way or another from what we expect, then a normal distribution will fail miserably because we exponentially punish deviation in a quadratic manner, so to speak. So it's extremely uncertain that that will happen. Whereas with, for example, the energy-based model we used, that will be picked up by the model. So in that sense, it has a capability to be more robust. So, so yes, I do believe that it will definitely have different model properties. And I think that, for example, robustness and so on are among them. And there's more to be understood there, but from what we see in running this on these examples from computer vision, it's pretty clear that it does well. And here I should also give credit to Frederick and Martin, who has been doing a lot of this work.
Thank you. Different Frederick, by the way.
I think you are muted, Umberto.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Before we wrap this session up, because it's 2:05 almost, and before thanking Thomas for this excellent talk, I would like to show you what happens next. So, okay, so the next meetings, the next talks, excellent talks will be by Barbara Plank from IT University of Copenhagen on 1st of October, at the same time at 1 p.m. And then Arthur Gretton from UCL, University College London. And we have a title, it's Learning to Generate Realistic Looking Images, and it's a critiques on GANs, or Generative Adversarial Networks. And then a final word about us. So this is us, the organizing team, Frederick Johansson, and myself. I haven't introduced myself, sorry, Umberto Picchini, Frederick Kahl, and Devdutt Bashi, and great help from our communication officers, Joanna Glissen and Malin Ulfarsson. So this is it for today. And thanks again, Thomas, for this talk. And it was really a great pleasure. And see you all in October. And please follow us on Twitter. And if you haven't already, tell colleagues to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.